When I was 11, my family moved to a small town in the countryside. The house we bought was beautiful, old but sturdy, with thick wooden beams and large windows. It backed onto an expansive forest, and from my bedroom window I could see deep into the woods, which always seemed a little too dark, even during the day. The townspeople were friendly but always seemed distant when they talked about the forest. They'd say things like, "Don't go wandering too far," or "Those woods have a way of playing tricks on you." My parents brushed it off as superstition, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong with the forest. After a few weeks, I started to notice things. Small, subtle things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Some nights, I would wake up to see movement in the trees, like shadows shifting just beyond the edge of the forest. I'd tell myself it was animals or the wind, but it always felt like something more, something alive. One evening, as I sat on my bed doing homework, I noticed something unusual from my window. Just beyond the first line of trees, I could see a faint glow, a flickering orange light, like a campfire deep in the woods. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The air was cold, and the woods loomed over me like a wall of shadow as I crossed the backyard. The trees creaked in the wind, and the forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. As I stepped into the woods, the light ahead flickered again. It wasn't a steady flame, it seemed to pulse, like a distant lantern swaying back and forth. I followed it, walking deeper into the forest, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. After a few minutes of walking, the light disappeared completely, leaving me standing alone in the cold, dark woods. My flashlight began to flicker. I tapped it, but the light grew dimmer, struggling to stay on. Panic started to creep in. I had no idea where I was. The trees all looked the same, tall and gnarled, and I realized I had wandered much farther than I intended. Just as I turned to go back, I heard something, a soft, whispering sound. At first it was so faint I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct, like voices. Multiple voices murmuring low and fast. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from all around me. The hair on my arms stood up. I swept my flashlight around, looking for any sign of the light, the source of the whispers, but saw nothing. The trees closed in and the air grew heavier, colder. That's when I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone from town. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't moving. It was just standing there in the shadows, barely visible. I called out, but there was no response. The whispers grew louder. I took a step back, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, it went out completely. When it came back on, the figure had moved. It was closer, still standing perfectly still, but now I could make out more of it. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't look like a person. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen. I turned and ran. The whispers followed me, growing louder, faster, more frantic. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks, the forest seeming to shift and twist around me. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, crashing through the underbrush. I ran and ran until finally I broke through the edge of the forest and into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My parents, startled by the noise, rushed in to see what was wrong. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled, and they just stared at me, confused. They told me it was just my imagination, that the woods could play tricks on people, especially at night. But I knew what I saw. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, soft and distant, but unmistakable. I kept checking the window, expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. The next morning, I went out to the backyard again. The sun was shining, and the forest looked much less threatening in the daylight. But when I walked to the edge of the woods, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just beyond the first row of trees, was a footprint. Not an animal's footprint, it was too large, too human. But the toes were long and spindly, and the heel was set at a strange angle, like whoever, or whatever, had made it wasn't quite built like a person. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they were still out there, waiting, watching. For the next few weeks, I avoided the woods. Even in the daylight, I wouldn't go near them. My parents started to notice how nervous I was, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But one night, about a month later, It happened again. I was lying in bed when I saw the light. It was the same flickering orange glow just beyond the tree line. My heart raced as I watched it, frozen with fear. This time, I didn't go outside. I didn't follow it. I just stared, hoping it would go away. And then, slowly, the light began to move toward the house. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just watched as the light came closer and closer until it reached the edge of the yard. It hovered there for a moment, flickering and swaying before fading out completely. For a few seconds, everything was still, silent. Then out of the darkness, I heard it. A soft whisper. Faint at first, then louder. Closer. I looked out my window and saw it. The figure. Standing in the middle of the yard. Its long limbs silhouetted against the trees. Its head tilted at that impossible angle. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there staring at the house. Staring at me. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, swirling around me. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. They were inside my head. I don't remember how long I stayed like that. Curled up on the floor, my hands over my ears, my heart racing. But when I finally looked up, the figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. I've never told anyone what happened that night. My parents wouldn't believe me, and the townspeople just give vague warnings about the woods. But I know the truth. Something lives in those woods. Something ancient and dark. It watches. It waits. And one day, it will come back for me. Story notes.